Her fingers traced the rough wool. The tribon lay across her lap, heavy not from its physical weight, but from what it represented, what it declared, what it dared 8 centuries of precedent to deny. Plato had worn such a cloak, Aristotle, Plotinus. Every philosopher whose name echoed through Alexandria's marble halls had wrapped himself in this same rough fabric, proclaiming to the world, "I am a teacher of wisdom. I claim authority over truth itself, and you will listen when I speak." No woman had ever worn it, until now. Hypatia pulled the tribon over her shoulders. The wool scratched against her neck, coarse against skin that had never felt this particular weight before, and something fundamental shifted in the room around her, as though reality itself took note of what she was attempting. Outside her door, Alexandria hummed with its morning chaos. Merchants shouted prices for dates and papyrus, donkeys brayed under loads of amphora wine, and the smell of fresh bread battled harbor salt and human sweat and fish guts rotting in the sun. Ordinary, predictable. The same sounds and smells that had greeted every dawn for 700 years. She stepped into the narrow lane. Everything changed. Picture this moment, truly picture it. At your doorway in ancient Alexandria, you're about to walk into the street wearing something you have absolutely no right to wear according to everyone who's ever lived, everyone whose opinion matters, everyone with power to make your life very difficult or very short. So hard does your heart pound it hurts. Copper and bile fill your mouth. Every instinct screams that you should go back inside, take off the cloak, return to the safe invisibility of being brilliant in private. But your feet move forward anyway, because some things matter more than safety, and you're about to discover exactly what that costs. A woman selling figs went silent mid-cry. Her mouth hung open, her eyes tracking Hypatia's movement down the street with an expression between shock and something that might have been exhilaration, the look of someone watching impossible things happen in real time. Then another merchant noticed, and another. Like wind before a storm, the murmuring started. Soft at first, building, spreading, amplifying as she walked toward the city center where crowds grew thick and dense and judgmental. The tribon announced what she was claiming, philosopher. Not philosopher's daughter, though she was Theon's child, raised on geometric proofs and astronomical calculations. Not philosopher's assistant, though she'd explained Apollonius to stumbling students while her father watched approvingly from his corner. Not even philosopher's widow, that marginally acceptable category that sometimes let women inherit authority through marriage and death. Philosopher, full stop, without qualification or apology. The cloak marked her as surely as a crown marked a king, a ring marked a senator, a cross marked a Christian. Every person who saw it understood immediately and completely what she was doing, and how impossible it should be, how unprecedented, how dangerous. Teaching philosophy? Not for women. Lecturing publicly? Forbidden. Walking through Alexandria's streets proclaiming themselves equal to Plato's intellectual heirs, demanding that the world recognize their authority over truth and wisdom and the life of the mind. Certainly not. Yet here she walked. Visible, vulnerable, defiant. Alexandria in the year 400 sprawled across 700 acres of marble and limestone and relentless ambition. The great library might have burned, twice some claimed, though the details varied with each telling, but the city's hunger for knowledge hadn't dimmed even slightly. Everywhere, competition. Philosophy schools competed for students and prestige like merchants fighting over market stalls. The Platonist school near the old temple district, the Stoic lecturers in their austere meeting halls, the Christian theologians debating fine points of doctrine in the Caesareum, everyone wanting to be the voice that mattered, the teacher-students sought, the authority magistrates consulted when difficult questions needed answers. She passed 3 such schools on her walk to the agora. Through open doorways, she glimpsed bearded men lecturing to rows of young aristocrats, sons of Alexandria's elite, dressed in expensive togas, taking notes on wax tablets, nodding gravely at their teachers' pronouncements. The philosophers' voices carried into the street, confident, authoritative, unquestioned. No one looked twice at them. They wore their tribons like second skins, unremarkable in their rightness, as natural as breathing. Her cloak turned heads, sparked whispers, challenged 8 centuries of assumption, made people stop mid-conversation and stare. What gave her the audacity? Some asked the question with genuine curiosity, true intellectual interest in how someone could dare such an impossible thing. Others asked with barely concealed fury, as though her existence insulted their understanding of how the world should work. And a few, a very few, asked with something like hope, wondering whether maybe, possibly, the boundaries everyone accepted as eternal might actually be breakable after all. The marble colonnade along the main thoroughfare offered shade from the relentless Egyptian sun, but Hypatia felt exposed anyway, naked despite the cloak, vulnerable despite the armor that philosophical authority was supposed to provide. Watching. A group of young men stopped their conversation mid-sentence, students judging by their togas and the scrolls they carried, and the way they clustered together with that particular mixture of arrogance and insecurity that marked the educated young, and one elbowed his companion. They pointed, their faces showing confusion first, then recognition, then something harder to name. Maybe respect, maybe resentment, maybe both tangled together in a knot they couldn't untangle themselves. She kept walking. Her sandals slapped against sun-warmed stone with a rhythm that matched her heartbeat, too fast, too loud, too obviously anxious for someone claiming philosophical authority. Deeper into the city's heart each step carried her, where crowds grew thicker and scrutiny sharper, and the weight of all those watching eyes pressed against her back like physical force. Years earlier, before the tribon, she'd taught privately in her father's home. Wealthy families sent their sons for mathematics instruction, and she'd assisted, explained difficult concepts when Theon's explanations didn't penetrate, demonstrated geometric proofs on sand tables, while her father watched approvingly from his chair. The mathematician's daughter. That's what the students called her. Brilliant, certainly, they acknowledged that much, because denying obvious competence would make them look foolish, and useful, yes, since her ability to clarify complex ideas helped them pass examinations and impress their own fathers. But not a teacher in her own right, not someone with independent authority, not someone whose wisdom mattered beyond her utility in explaining someone else's knowledge. That title chafed, the mathematician's daughter, as though her identity existed only through relationship to Theon, her brilliance only noteworthy as reflection of his mentorship, her future bounded by his eventual death when she'd presumably fade into irrelevance like a lamp extinguished. By age 25, she'd surpassed her father's abilities in conic sections. Her commentaries on Apollonius demonstrated insights Theon himself admitted he'd never considered, insights that revealed deeper patterns in the geometry, connections between different approaches, implications that opened new avenues of investigation, and her astronomical calculations corrected errors in Ptolemy's tables. Improving predictions of planetary positions and lunar cycles in ways that made her father shake his head in amazed frustration that his daughter had caught mistakes he'd lived with for decades. Brilliant? Not enough. Exceptional? Insufficient. Recognized. She needed recognition, and recognition required visibility, and visibility required claiming space that tradition said belonged to someone else. The tribon made her visible, dangerously so. Think about it from a modern perspective. Really think about it. How many women had to be twice as good to get half as far? How many demonstrated competence that would have won male colleagues immediate promotion, only to hear they needed more experience, more publications, more proof that their excellence wasn't accidental? How many performed not just privately, where brilliance could be acknowledged then forgotten, but publicly, undeniably, until even hostile eyes couldn't deny what stood before them? Hypatia understood the calculation with mathematical precision. Private brilliance meant nothing if the world never saw it. Hidden excellence changed nothing, helped no one, broke no barriers. So she chose visibility despite its dangers, chose to be seen despite every instinct screaming for the safety of invisibility. She chose the cloak. Before her, the agora opened, Alexandria's commercial and civic heart, where money and power and ideas collided in productive chaos. Against administrative buildings, market stalls crowded. Grilled fish and cumin-spiced meat mingled their scents with papyrus dust and lamp oil and the particular acrid scent of fresh-dyed wool. Hundreds of people milled through the square. Merchants haggling over grain prices, magistrates consulting about tax disputes, philosophers recruiting students with promises of wisdom and connections and future careers in imperial service. Beneath a colonnade near the prefect's offices, she found her spot. Not by accident, this location. Government officials came and went constantly through these corridors. Educated men paused here between meetings, killing time and looking for distraction. Students gathered hoping to glimpse important figures, to overhear significant conversations, to make connections that might advance their futures. Perfect audience. Hypatia raised her voice, not shouting, which would be undignified, but projecting with the technique she'd practiced until her father complained about hearing Platonic forms discussed from 3 rooms away, until the servants knew exactly when her geometry lessons were happening because her voice carried through solid walls. Consider the sphere. A few heads turned. The tribon drew their eyes first, shock, curiosity, outrage playing across different faces depending on temperament and prejudice, but her words held them. Why? Not because she spoke to the educated elite in their specialized jargon, not because she demonstrated cleverness for its own sake, but because she made mathematics accessible, turned abstract geometry into questions anyone could grasp. Apollonius tells us a sphere results from rotating a semicircle around its diameter. She traced the motion in the air with her hands, simple, clear, visual. Simple enough, yes, but here's what becomes interesting. What happens when we slice that sphere at different angles? More people stopped. Merchants and magistrates standing shoulder to shoulder, united by curiosity despite the social gulf that normally separated them. A Christian priest watching from the periphery, his expression carefully neutral in a way that suggested intense interest masked by professional obligation not to seem too engaged with pagan philosophy. 3 young men who looked like students craning their necks for better views, whispering to each other while trying not to be obvious about it. Growing. Cut straight across and you get circles, everyone knows this. Hypatia kept her hands moving, kept the demonstration visual and engaging. But slice at an angle? Now you get ellipses, parabolas, hyperbolas. The same sphere cut different ways reveals entirely different forms. So here's my question. What does this tell us about the nature of reality itself? Is the sphere's truth the circle it produces with, one cut, or the parabola from another, or something deeper that underlies them all? A small crowd had gathered, maybe 30 people, which was remarkable for an impromptu lecture, which was dangerous for someone already courting visibility, which was exactly what she needed if she was going to make this audacious claim to authority stick. Hypatia felt the familiar thrill she'd experienced since childhood. The moment when abstract concepts clicked into place behind listeners' eyes, when mathematics transformed from rote calculation into philosophical revelation, when people realized they were thinking thoughts they'd never thought before. This was why she wore the cloak, not just to claim authority, though yes, that mattered, that was necessary, that was the price of admission to being taken seriously, but to use that authority for something that mattered. To teach in a way that reached beyond elite private students and their expensive tutors, to make philosophy a public conversation rather than a privilege hoarded by the wealthy and well-born, to demonstrate that wisdom belonged to anyone capable of grasping it regardless of their social position or available coin. Mathematics her father Theon had taught her. He'd also taught her something more valuable, though he might not have intended the lesson. Knowledge unused was knowledge wasted. If she understood the heavens' movements and geometric forms' hidden relationships, and the path from material observation to ideal forms to the one itself, what good did that knowledge do locked inside her head? None. And how did it serve the city, the empire, the human quest for truth, if she kept it private and safe and invisible. It didn't. The sphere demonstration led naturally into astronomy. She explained how understanding conic sections allowed better astronomical predictions, how elliptical paths of heavenly bodies weren't random irregularities, but revealed deeper mathematical relationships between the moving spheres. How abstraction from individual observations to general principles mirrored the Neoplatonic ascent from material forms to ideal forms to the ultimate one that underlay and unified all reality. How mathematics wasn't just practical calculation for merchants and tax collectors, but a spiritual discipline, a contemplative practice, a path toward the divine that required no temple and no priest beyond the individual soul's capacity for abstract thought. Mathematics as spiritual practice. Geometry as path to divinity. The crowd had tripled. People packed the colonnade, 3 deep, pressing close to hear, bodies radiating heat in the already sweltering Egyptian morning, and not all were friendly. She saw hostility on some faces, calculation on others, the particular expression of men who resented being interested despite themselves. Listening. They listened, even the hostile ones, even the ones who thought women shouldn't teach, pulled forward anyway by curiosity stronger than prejudice. An hour later, when she finished, the crowd dispersed slowly, reluctantly, as though breaking a spell they didn't quite want to end. With questions, several people approached. A young man with a Syrian accent asked about studying with her formally. His father was a merchant, he explained, wealthy enough to afford good instruction, but not aristocratic enough for the most prestigious schools. Could she take him as a student? A magistrate inquired whether she might consult on a property dispute involving geometric measurements of irregular land plots. And a merchant's wife, rare sight in the agora, doubly rare approaching a strange woman publicly, asked in a low voice whether Hypatia taught women. Later, walking home with the tribon now familiar against her shoulders despite the wool's persistent scratchiness, that last question echoed. Did she teach women? Should she? Could she? Haunting her, these questions. The risks multiplied with each step into public life. Teaching meant students, and students meant relationships that transcended the lecture hall, friendships, alliances, networks of influence that could protect her or expose her depending on who was watching and what they saw. Her unmarried status helped. She belonged to no man who might forbid her teaching or demand she remain home managing household slaves and spinning wool like respectable women did, yet that same independence made her vulnerable in different ways. No husband's family to shield her, no children to make her sympathetic to the mothers who might otherwise see her as threat to proper gender boundaries. Just her knowledge, her reputation, and the cloak that proclaimed both. The sun had traced its arc toward the western horizon by the time she reached home. Her feet ached, sandals weren't designed for hours of standing on marble, and her soles burned where the leather had rubbed them raw. Her throat felt raw from hours of public speaking, voice hoarse in a way that would take warm wine with honey to soothe. But satisfaction warmed her more than the Egyptian heat ever could. The tribon she'd worn. Publicly she'd taught. An audience she'd commanded despite every tradition that said she had no right to any of those things. Tomorrow, she'd do it again. In the eastern wing of her house, her lecture hall occupied converted storage rooms that had once held grain and wine and the accumulated detritus of Theon's long life. Tables now lined the walls, their surfaces covered with fine sand for geometric demonstrations that could be smoothed and redrawn endlessly. From ceiling hooks, astronomical instruments hung, astrolabes for measuring stellar positions, armillary spheres for demonstrating planetary movements, a water clock that measured time with impressive accuracy through controlled drips. Along every wall, scrolls filled built shelves. Euclid's Elements, Apollonius's Conics, Diophantus's Arithmetica, Ptolemy's Almagest, Plotinus's Enneads, Plato's Timaeus and Republic, and all the dialogues. Dawn. Before it, students began arriving, expected. Hypatia had learned to expect this. Serious pupils wanted maximum time with their teacher before the day's heat made concentration difficult, before administrative obligations called them away, before the city's noise levels made sustained intellectual work nearly impossible, and they came from everywhere, which still amazed her despite years of building this reputation. Aristocratic Egyptians from Alexandria's wealthy quarters, Syrians who'd traveled weeks for her instruction, sleeping in cheap inns and spending their father's money on an education they hoped would lead to imperial careers, even a handful from Constantinople undertaking thousand-mile journeys and months of travel, all to study with a woman philosopher in a provincial capital. Not the students themselves, but their religious diversity struck outside observers first. Beside pagans, Christians sat without apparent tension. Sand tables followers of the ancient gods shared with those who'd embraced the new faith. In a city increasingly fractured by religious conflict, where bishops battled philosophers and mobs attacked temples and theological arguments ended in street violence, as an island of intellectual unity, Hypatia's school remained. Impossible? Perhaps. Yet deliberately she'd cultivated this. Years earlier, when Christian students first approached, some advisors had warned her to refuse them. Teaching Christians meant dangerous visibility with the church, they argued, meant accusations of corrupting the faithful, leading them astray, undermining orthodoxy with pagan philosophy, meant making enemies of bishops who saw education as their exclusive territory, their right to control and gatekeep and use for political purposes. Where others saw danger, Hypatia saw opportunity. If Christians sought knowledge, let them find it in her school. Let them see that philosophy and faith weren't enemies, that both sought truth, both valued contemplation, both recognized that reality extended beyond material appearances. Let them carry her influence into the church's hierarchy itself, demonstrating that wisdom transcended religious boundaries. This morning, she taught conic sections to 6 students clustered around the largest sand table, her finger tracing smooth lines through the sand. Circles, ellipses, parabolas, hyperbolas, each curve emerging from the same underlying cone cut at different angles in a demonstration that was visual, tactile, memorable, in ways that verbal explanation alone could never achieve. Letting students see the relationships, trace them with their own fingers, internalize the patterns through multiple senses working together. Constant. The cone itself remains constant, she explained, her voice carrying the precise clarity she demanded from her students' own explanations, while what changes is our perspective, our angle of approach. Different viewpoints revealing different truths about the same underlying reality. So here's what I want you to consider. If a single cone produces multiple distinct curves depending on how we slice it, what does that suggest about forms themselves? Forward leaned a young man named Synesius, recent arrival from Cyrene, brilliant mind, boundless curiosity, the kind of student teachers dream about. Genuinely interested in ideas rather than just credentials, willing to follow arguments wherever they led even when conclusions challenged comfortable assumptions. But if the cone remains constant, which curve represents its true nature, he asked? The circle? The hyperbola? Or are all equally true despite appearing completely different? Perfect. Exactly the question she'd hoped someone would ask. This was why she loved teaching, not the rote transmission of established knowledge which any competent tutor could do, but moments like this. When a student grasped that mathematics opened philosophical doors, when abstraction from particular problems revealed general principles that applied far beyond geometry. Ask yourself, Hypatia said, smoothing the sand to start a new demonstration, whether the forms themselves possess a single fixed nature or whether they reveal different aspects depending on how we approach them. Can the good show itself differently to different souls while remaining wholly itself? Can truth appear as geometry to one person, astronomy to another, ethics to a third, all equally valid manifestations of the same underlying reality? In the air, the question hung. At each other, students glanced, minds working through implications. She could practically see them connecting geometric demonstrations to Platonic metaphysics to their own spiritual seeking. About divine truth and multiple paths to God, Christians in the group would be thinking, Plotinus's one and the various emanations pagans would be considering. Both would be wrestling with how unity manifests as diversity without losing its essential oneness. At its deepest level, this was the lesson the tribon represented. Not just claiming authority as a woman in a male domain, though yes, that mattered, that was revolutionary, that broke barriers that desperately needed breaking. But using that authority to demonstrate something more fundamental. That truth transcended the categories people used to fight each other. That wisdom belonged to anyone capable of grasping it, regardless of gender or religion or social position. That the divisions tearing Alexandria apart were less real than the unity underlying them, if only people had eyes to see, ears to hear, minds capable of abstraction from surface differences to deeper patterns. Mathematics to philosophy to theology, pagan traditions to Christian innovations, public teaching to private transformation. A Christian Bishop Synesius would later become. Years from now, he'd write letters to Hypatia, seeking her wisdom on theological questions, philosophical problems, even practical matters of governance. Outlasting her life, their relationship, pagan teacher, Christian student, would be preserved in his correspondence for future generations to puzzle over and argue about and use as evidence in debates about early Christianity's relationship to classical philosophy. How did she do it? How did a pagan philosopher command such devotion from Christian pupils that they maintained intellectual relationships even after ascending to positions of religious authority? In this room the answer sat, in these hours before dawn when sleep still clouded most of the city, when only the truly dedicated dragged themselves from warm beds to grapple with geometric proofs and astronomical calculations and abstract metaphysical speculation. She taught students to think, not what to think. She demonstrated that truth transcended religious boundaries, that both Plato and Paul could be right about fundamental things despite approaching them from different angles, like the cone producing different curves depending on where you sliced it. She showed them that intellectual honesty mattered more than doctrinal purity, that asking good questions trumped having approved answers, that the life of the mind was compatible with the life of faith if both were pursued with genuine commitment to truth rather than tribal loyalty. And she did it all while wearing the cloak that said she belonged among history's great teachers. The geometric demonstration concluded. Students copied diagrams onto their wax tablets, asked clarifying questions about calculations, debated implications of what they'd learned. Hypatia moved between them, adjusting a proof here, correcting a calculation there, always pushing them toward deeper understanding rather than settling for surface comprehension. Finally, when they departed, heading to their own homes or the public baths or their various temples and churches, alone in the lecture hall she stood, studying the sand tables covered with intersecting curves and geometric proofs. How many women before her had taught mathematics? Precious few, and none she'd heard of who'd claimed the kind of public authority she was asserting. Philosophy? None that history remembered, none whose names survived, none who'd worn the tribon and lectured to crowds in the agora. In equal measure, the weight of that pioneering terrified and thrilled her. What she'd started couldn't easily be stopped. Students talked. They wrote letters home describing their remarkable teacher, the woman philosopher who taught better than most men, who made abstract concepts clear and compelling, who built intellectual communities that transcended religious warfare. They told friends in other cities. Their friends told others. Reputation spread like ripples from a stone thrown in the harbor, outward, expanding, touching shores she'd never see. With reputation came influence. With influence came danger. Inevitable? Yes. 3 years after she'd begun public teaching, the prefect Orestes first summoned her. His messenger arrived. One afternoon, formal and polite and carefully non-threatening, requesting her presence the following morning to consult on an administrative matter, and the summons itself was neutral enough. Magistrates occasionally sought expert opinions on technical disputes involving property boundaries that required geometric calculation, astronomical events that needed prediction for festival planning, philosophical questions about justice and governance. Timing, that worried her. Religious tensions in Alexandria had been escalating for years, like a fever that never quite broke but kept spiking higher with each cycle, and the new Bishop Cyril had been making increasingly aggressive moves against both pagans and Jews. Temple destructions, mob violence, theological denunciations that sounded less like arguments and more like calls for political action against anyone who disagreed with his interpretation of Christian orthodoxy. Orestes represented imperial authority, Constantinople's power rather than the church's, the emperor's law rather than the bishop's will. But navigating between emperor and bishop required political skill that many prefects lacked. And one misstep meant either buckling to Cyril's demands and losing imperial confidence, or resisting the bishop and facing mob violence that could make the city ungovernable. Where did a philosopher fit in such calculations? Precisely at dawn, Hypatia arrived at the prefect's palace, wearing her tribon despite knowing the visibility it brought. Or perhaps because of that visibility, because refusing to wear it now would signal weakness, would suggest she could be intimidated into invisibility. Recognition. The guards' reactions told her everything she needed to know about her growing notoriety. They recognized her immediately, whispered to each other with a mixture of respect and something like wariness, let her pass with a deference usually reserved for aristocrats and high officials, not because of her family connections or wealth, which were modest, but because of her reputation. Knowledge as power. Authority earned rather than inherited. Orestes met her in a small office overlooking the harbor. Through the window, she could see merchant ships being loaded, fishing boats heading out to sea, the morning sun turning the water molten gold and making her squint against the glare. "You know why I've asked you here," Orestes said without preamble. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 40, with the careful eyes of someone who'd learned that words could kill as surely as swords, that political mistakes in Alexandria often ended in blood. "I can guess," Hypatia replied. Bishop Cyril's actions have created complications for civil administration. Complications. Orestes barked a laugh devoid of humor, bitter with frustration. He's destroying synagogues, inciting mobs. Last week, 3 pagan philosophers were beaten in broad daylight, and my guards couldn't intervene without triggering a riot that would have burned half the city. He's not Bishop of Alexandria. He's becoming its shadow emperor, making policy through violence, while I represent an authority everyone knows I can't actually enforce. She waited. Politicians who vented usually wanted advice, not agreement. They wanted someone to confirm their analysis and suggest solutions. They wanted allies who could see the full picture and help navigate impossible situations. I need allies who understand this city's intellectual traditions, Orestes continued, leaning forward with intensity that suggested this conversation mattered deeply to him, that he'd thought carefully about approaching her, that this was strategy rather than impulse. People the educated class respects. People who can speak about philosophy and religion without setting fires, literal or metaphorical. People who bridge the divide between pagan and Christian communities because they've actually built relationships across that divide rather than just talking about unity in abstract terms. He meant her, obviously. But stating it explicitly would commit them both to a dangerous alliance, would make her visible in new ways, would connect her to political power in a city where political power was becoming a death sentence for anyone who chose wrong. I teach mathematics and philosophy, Hypatia said carefully, weighing each word. I have students from various religious backgrounds. My work involves understanding different perspectives and finding truth that transcends particular dogmas, showing people that the categories they use to fight each other are less real than the unity underlying them. Exactly. Orestes' eyes lit with something like hope. And when those perspectives clash, when dogma demands submission rather than understanding, the question's weight pressed against her like the tribon itself. She could decline involvement, return to her school, teach her students, maintain her careful neutrality. Many would call that wisdom, safety through invisibility, survival by avoiding the dangerous ground where religion and politics collided. But she'd chosen the tribon precisely because she refused invisibility. Truth doesn't submit to dogma, she said. It illuminates dogma's limits. When perspectives clash, the philosopher's role is showing there are questions more important than the immediate conflict. Questions about the nature of reality, the path to wisdom, the relationship between knowledge and virtue. Questions that put temporary political struggles in proper perspective. Orestes studied her for a long moment. Bishop Cyril won't appreciate that answer. He believes he possesses absolute truth revealed by God. Questions about limits threaten his entire worldview. Suggesting his political struggles are temporary will make him see you as enemy rather than neutral party. Then he shouldn't have become bishop of a city that's debated philosophy for 7 centuries. The prefect smiled. It wasn't a happy expression. It was the smile of someone who'd found an ally and knew that alliance would cost them both dearly. "Will you help me?" he asked. "Not as formal advisor. That would make you an official political target, and we both know how that ends. But as someone I can consult? Someone whose wisdom might prevent this city from tearing itself apart?" She should have said no, should have recognized the trap, should have understood that visibility to power was the most dangerous visibility of all, should have remembered that in political conflicts, neutrals get killed by both sides for refusing to choose. Instead, yes, looking back, and she would have years to look back, to analyze this decision from every angle, to understand exactly how it led to what followed. That moment marked the transformation from philosopher to political figure. From teacher to power broker. From someone wearing a symbolic cloak to someone whose cloak made her a symbol that both sides would fight over, use, ultimately destroy. The alliances she built should have been impossible in 415 Alexandria. Christians and pagans didn't collaborate, they fought. Philosophers and bishops didn't consult each other, they condemned. Private teachers didn't advise prefects, they avoided political entanglements that could destroy reputations and end careers and sometimes end lives. Impossible. Yet here was Hypatia, bridging every divide. Her students included pagans and Christians, not just coexisting but genuinely learning together, forming friendships that would outlast their time in her school, while her teaching synthesized Platonic philosophy with ideas Christians could embrace, showing that the ascent to the One and the ascent to God might be different descriptions of the same spiritual journey. And her public lectures attracted diverse audiences who came not despite her refusal to take religious sides, but because of it. And her consultation with Orestes connected her to imperial power, making her useful to those who wanted someone who could speak truth to both Christian and pagan extremists. Indispensable, and therefore dangerous. In a different time, her unique position might have protected her, her ability to bridge hostile communities, to speak wisdom that transcended faction, to build intellectual unity in a fractured city, might have been assets that even enemies respected enough not to destroy. Nuance. 415 CE wasn't a time for it. As betrayal of Christian truth, Bishop Cyril saw collaboration with pagans. As capitulation to hostile forces, the pagan philosophers saw teaching Christians. Absolute loyalty both sides wanted. You were either with them or against them, either a warrior in their cause or an enemy to be crushed. Hypatia offered something else. Intellectual integrity that refused to choose sides in a false conflict. She taught truth, not faction. She built community across religious divides. She demonstrated that wisdom transcended the categories that were tearing Alexandria apart, that a Christian could learn from a pagan teacher without abandoning faith, that a philosopher could respect Christian students without betraying philosophical tradition. Bishop Cyril hated that, not because he was cruel, though he could be, not because he was stupid, though his theology often prioritized power over intellectual coherence, but because Hypatia's very existence undermined everything he'd built his authority on. If Christians could learn from pagan philosophers, what need did they have for bishops to interpret divine truth? If philosophy and faith could coexist peacefully, why the urgent battle against heresy? If someone like Hypatia could command respect from both communities, what did that say about the exclusive authority he claimed? Her success challenged his worldview at its foundations. The public teaching that had built her reputation now made her vulnerable. Every lecture drew crowds, and those crowds included Cyril's informants. They reported what she taught, who attended, which Christian students seemed most devoted to their pagan teacher, evidence of corruption, they called it, of paganism's insidious influence over the faithful. They noted her consultations with Orestes. They tracked her influence. They documented her bridge building as though it were a crime rather than a miracle. They made her visible in ways she couldn't control. Modern parallels come easily if you look for them. Think about public intellectuals today who refuse to join partisan tribes, who insist on nuance in a time demanding absolutes, who build audiences across ideological divides, who won't perform the tribal loyalty rituals that both sides demand. Think about how they get attacked. The right calling them secret leftists, the left calling them crypto-fascists, both sides insisting they choose a team and defend it absolutely. Think about how exhausting that is, how dangerous, how the pressure to capitulate builds daily, how tempting invisibility becomes when visibility means constant assault. Hypatia lived that reality, 1600 years before Twitter made it ubiquitous. Her students saw the danger before she fully acknowledged it. Synesius, now a Christian bishop himself in far-off Cyrene, wrote letters warning that Cyril's hostility was escalating from theological disagreement to political threat. Other students begged her to lower her profile, perhaps teach only privately, certainly avoid public association with Orestes, definitely stop wearing the tribon that made her so conspicuous. She refused. The tribon meant something. It meant standing for philosophy even when philosophy became politically inconvenient. It meant teaching truth even when truth made powerful people uncomfortable. It meant being visible even when visibility invited danger. What's the price of integrity? Your reputation? Maybe. Your career? Often. Your life? Sometimes, especially in cities like Alexandria, where bishops commanded mobs and mobs answered to no law. The community she'd built remained loyal. Christians and pagans both defended her. Students testified to her brilliance, her fairness, her refusal to proselytize or condemn anyone's faith. Even some of Cyril's own clergy privately admitted that Hypatia represented the best of Alexandria's intellectual tradition, the kind of synthesis between classical philosophy and Christian thought that the church should embrace rather than destroy. But loyalty couldn't protect her from mob violence, and Cyril had mobs. Dangerous. In her final months, Hypatia continued teaching as though nothing had changed. The lecture hall still filled before dawn. Students still clustered around sand tables tracing geometric proofs. She still wore the tribon through Alexandria's streets, still gave public lectures to crowds who knew exactly how dangerous it was becoming to be seen listening to a pagan philosopher. Still consulted with Orestes on administrative matters, despite knowing that every meeting was being reported to Cyril's network. The cloak had become inseparable from her identity. She couldn't remove it without removing herself, without becoming someone other than the philosopher she'd claimed to be, without betraying every student who'd seen her example and dared to think that barriers might be breakable after all. So she kept wearing it, kept teaching, kept bridging divides, even as those divides became abysses that swallowed anyone who tried crossing them. Legacy. What would be hers? Not the books she wrote. None survived if she wrote any at all. Not mathematical discoveries. Others would later claim credit for her insights, or the insights were simply lost when Alexandria's libraries finally failed completely. Not astronomical calculations, useful in her time, superseded by later observations, forgotten in the archives. Her legacy was the idea itself, that a woman could wear the philosopher's cloak, that gender didn't determine intellectual authority, that excellence transcended the boundaries others tried to enforce, that claiming space for yourself opened space for everyone who came after. Possible. She proved it, and paid the price for proving it. Footsteps. Every woman who's entered a male-dominated field since has walked in Hypatia's footsteps, whether she knows it or not, wearing her own version of the tribon, claiming her own version of authority, proving her own version of the fundamental truth that competence matters more than gender. While every public intellectual who's refused tribal loyalty carries forward her example, and every teacher who's built communities across dividing lines continues her work. The tribon represented an ancient tradition. Yes, 8 centuries of male philosophers had worn similar cloaks before Hypatia was born, but when she donned hers, she transformed what it meant. It became not just a symbol of philosophical authority passed from master to student in unbroken succession back to Plato himself, but a declaration that such authority belonged to anyone capable of grasping it. Regardless of what 8 centuries of precedent suggested, regardless of what contemporary society assumed, regardless of the danger that claiming it might bring. That's why Bishop Cyril saw her as existentially dangerous. Not because she was pagan. Plenty of pagans lived quietly in Alexandria, keeping to themselves, practicing their traditions without making public claims. Not because she was brilliant. Brilliance could be ignored if it remained private, contained, invisible. But because she was all 3, pagan, brilliant, and visible. Because she demonstrated that women could claim philosophical authority and make it stick through sheer excellence. Because she built communities that undermined his claim to exclusive religious authority. Because she existed loudly in a time when powerful men needed her silence. Her visibility threatened the order he was building. She knew the danger. Her students' warnings made it clear. The attacks in Cyril's sermons grew increasingly personal. The hostility when she walked through certain quarters of the city became palpable. Friends advised her to leave Alexandria, perhaps travel to Constantinople where imperial authority still meant something, where bishops couldn't command mobs with impunity. But leaving would mean abandoning her students, abandoning the intellectual community she'd built, abandoning the principle that wisdom belonged in public, that philosophy should be accessible, that truth transcended religious faction. So she stayed. Continued teaching, continued wearing the cloak through Alexandria's streets even as those streets grew more dangerous, continued consulting with Orestes even as that alliance marked her in Cyril's eyes as political enemy rather than neutral philosopher. In March of 415, during Lent when religious fervor ran highest, the accumulated tensions erupted, violently. Cyril's parabalani surrounded her chariot as she traveled home from giving a public lecture. These men, nominally a group charged with caring for the sick, practically the bishop's private militia, dragged her from the vehicle. They stripped her. They killed her brutally in the Caesareum, the very church where Christian and pagan Alexandria had once managed uneasy coexistence. The philosopher's cloak couldn't protect her body, but it couldn't be taken from her either. She died wearing it in every sense that mattered. As a teacher, as a philosopher, as someone who'd claimed authority based on excellence rather than gender, as someone who demonstrated that the boundaries everyone accepted as eternal were actually breakable if you were brave enough to test them. She died wearing it, and in dying proved that some things matter more than survival. Today, 1600 years later, we remember Hypatia not for her mathematical discoveries, those are lost, not for her astronomical calculations, others claimed them, not even for her philosophical innovations, her books didn't survive whatever bibliocost consumed them. We remember her for walking Alexandria's streets in that cloak, for teaching publicly when women weren't supposed to teach at all, for building an intellectual community that transcended religious warfare, for demonstrating that gender was irrelevant to wisdom, for refusing to become invisible even when invisibility might have saved her life, for proving it was possible even when proving it cost everything. The tribon hangs in history now, invisible but undeniable, like the forms themselves. Every woman in academia wears a version of it. Every female public intellectual claims a version of the authority it represents. Every woman who enters a traditionally male domain and refuses to apologize for her competence continues the work Hypatia started. The fabric has changed. The specific battles have shifted. The dangers take different forms in different eras, but the essential challenge remains exactly the same. claiming space that precedent says belongs to someone else, demanding recognition based on excellence rather than gender, being visible despite every pressure toward invisibility. Hypatia showed how. She wore the cloak. She taught brilliantly. She built alliances across impossible divides. She refused to become invisible even when invisibility offered safety. She demonstrated that some principles matter more than survival, that claiming truth and teaching wisdom and building intellectual community across religious faction were worth dying for if dying was what it took. Her choice wasn't naive. She understood the risks with the same mathematical precision she brought to geometric proofs. She calculated the costs. She recognized the danger. And she wore the tribon anyway because some things matter more than personal safety, because proving that women could claim philosophical authority mattered more than her individual life, because opening that door would benefit every woman who came after even if she didn't survive to walk through it herself. 16 centuries later, we're still learning the lessons she taught, still fighting battles she pioneered, still proving, again and again in different contexts with different specifics, but the same fundamental challenge, that the cloak fits anyone bold enough to wear it, that authority based on excellence transcends the categories society uses to deny it. She walked Alexandria's streets in a philosopher's tribon. She made that walk count. The rest is history, her history, our history, the history of every woman who's claimed space that tradition said belonged to someone else. She wore the cloak, and she changed what it meant to wear it. That's the only legacy that matters.